It would be presumptuous of the Economic Resource Council to step up here and say that we were going to enlighten you about AI totally. Um, Everything in the media has been talking about AI for the last 6 months, and everybody has their bent on it. And depending on what their position is, they'll slant it in a certain kind of a way. But the sum total, as I understand it, as I believe it, as I hear it and understand it, is that they would have us believe that AI is at the front door knocking, and if we don't open it, they'll break it down. And I want to be prepared in case that eventuality should happen. So this morning and this afternoon, we have two speakers. I have to report to you that we have a third speaker who was supposed to be in on Zoom, had an emergency, could not make it. He's back in Michigan, but he has promised to give us another hour on Zoom at probably in the next week or so, and we will let everyone know about that. His portion of it was to be talking about what he sees, and he studied this at length. His portion was going to be about what's the workforce likely to look like and be impacted by AI. I think that these two gentlemen will also speak about that somewhat. So we're privileged today to have Mr. Eric Little here, an attorney at law. We've made all the jokes about him we're going to do today. He's now in free country on jokes. He's got some very interesting take on AI. I'm particularly happy to welcome Leo Zillman here today. Leo is I don't know. If that's a sign where I just went dead. There we go. I'm back on. So anyway, Leo Zilm is here from Lardis, and he's going to talk a little bit about what he does with AI. And there's going to be plenty of time at the end for Q&A so that we can pepper them with specific questions about specific things you have. My hope in coming out of all of this is that we'll see some opportunities for AI in the business community within Nevada County. Um, I don't know where AI is going to go. I'm hoping we'll learn some of that today, but that is my wish, is that we will learn some things. This won't be the last time we will convene this kind of an information set. So look forward to more of these. So now I would like you to welcome to the stage my really cool friend, Eric Little.
Uh, So uh, I have a bunch of slides today for you. Um, I think they're going to be a little different than slides that you normally see because most of them have no words on them. But they're designed to serve as a mnemonic for me about things to talk about. Uh, and the first slide is not really quite the one I wanted to have. When I was first asked to talk about AI and the law, I thought maybe the most interesting thing was, what is it that's been invented? So I went out, I asked Dolly and played with a couple of other graphics packages trying to get this image reversed. But the thing I can tell you is there are not inexpensive free packages that are yet good enough that we could replace God with man and vice versa. But I left this up nonetheless. Uh, so let me see if I can get this right. Yes. Whoa. I hope you can see that. It's kind of dark on my screen. Uh, the the analogy to generative AI that's been made from time to time by people that know it fairly well is that it is really a big deal. It's as big a deal as the invention of movable type and the printing press. Uh, and so I'd like to start a little bit with that. Uh, Actually, Gil, is there a way I can keep track of how much time I'm using? Okay. Can I get a 15-minute wave and a 20-minute wave? Okay. Um, I don't know whether I'm going to be far over or far short, but we'll give it a try. So the printing revolution is interesting in a number of different ways, and I'm going to actually use it as a theme. for sort of the two sides of my talk. Uh, as you know, as people think of the printing press as making books easily available, letting authors communicate across space and time in a much more facile fashion than when there were hand scribes that were copying each book. But it also accompanied a change in sort of the understanding of the law around books. Back when books were copied by scribes, there was no real strong sense of ownership. The scribe maybe got paid by a patron for the time that was spent, but they were free to copy, although there are a small handful of cases of owners of libraries objecting when somebody copied one of their books. There was that was nothing like what we think about in terms of copyright today. So Gutenberg invented, he's known for inventing the printing press. There were actually a number of technologies involved, but that was introduced in Germany around 1445. By 1476, the printing press had made it to England. And just a minute here. I also have notes. Okay, so one of the things I've skipped here is why is AI like the printing press? Well, there was a study done in April by some folks at Stanford and MIT, and they found an increase among just basically clerical workers of 14% per hour for those individuals using AI to assist them in their tasks. I can tell you it's going to have a dramatic effect on the professional as well. I would say the impact on law, on medicine is likely to be even more dramatic. I have noticed a real difference in my practice since I started using ChatGPT-4. I can talk about that more later on if it's of interest to people. But the scale is really similar to that. The impact, I believe, will be similar to that involving the printing press. So the printing press pretty quickly got regulated. I can't even, excuse me. Oh, we're back to the printing press. In London, there was the worshipful company of stationers. Stationers at the time of the printing press were bookbinders, illuminators, booksellers, and they were relatively quickly given by Henry VII, I think it was, the right to reproduce books. First, the books were specific books. The right to reproduce specific books was granted by the Crown. And then more generally, the right was awarded to the stationers' company. The requirement was that all books had to be registered by the stationers' company, and you couldn't produce a book unless it was registered. There were a couple of exceptions where there were other institutions involved, principally Oxford, had the right to reproduce books. But the reproduction was heavily controlled. And there were only a small number of stationers. At one point, the number of stationers, the number of people who could print and reproduce and sell books was 20. So if you were an author in London, and you wanted your book to be printed, you had to go to them. You might sell them the manuscript for a few dollars, but you had no further right to that, and you didn't really get any royalties to it. The right was given, if it was granted by the crown, it was for a specific number of years. Later on, it just accrued to the printer that had registered the book. And this state of affairs existed more or less through the 1500s, the 1600s, and then as the printing industry became more disputatious. There were more arguments among printers as to who had the right to print what book. And equally important, sort of a general increasing emphasis in the culture on individual rights. In the reign of Queen Anne in 1709, 1710, was passed the Statute of Anne, which created a copyright in favor of authors for the first time. And it gave the author a copyright to a book for 14 years. If they were alive at the end of 14 years, they got another 14 years. And that quickly but it didn't mean they could print the book unless they were a member of the Stationers Guild. So the author still had to go to the printer and have the printer print the book. There was still registration of the book. But the author was in a much better negotiating position. Pretty quickly, though, after these copyrights expired, there were disputes among the printers as to what happened after the copyright expired. Did the book then, did the right to copy, after the author's copyright expired, did the printer continue to have exclusive rights to print the book, or was it in the public domain? And there were several lawsuits about this, with the area being somewhat murky, until 1774, when there was a dispute that went to the House of Lords between Donaldson and Becket. Donaldson had previously had the copyright to the book, claimed that he now had a perpetual common law copyright that had been infringed by Becket, who, after the author's copyright expired, started printing the book. And it's a fairly momentous decision, because it held that on the expiration of a copyright, a book goes into the public domain and can be copied by anyone at that point. And notice that decision in 1774 is pretty close to 1776. And that's, if you go to the, let's see where I am on my pictures. Oh, there's Queen Anne, and there's the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was heavily influenced in many ways by the history of the Printing Guild, and we'll get to more of that later. But the first thing to do is to note the language in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, which gives to Congress the right to enact statutes to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. There's hardly a word there that hasn't been the subject of litigation. But this brings us to the first really legal question about artificial intelligence, and that is, so I'm sure you've read that ChatGPT went out, trained by going out and reading everything it could get its hands on. And there are now lawsuits by authors, industry groups, claiming that when it read their writings on the internet, it violated their copyright to those writings. And we'll spend some time discussing that. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order here, if I can. Let's see here. Maybe that doesn't work. Okay. Let me jump ahead then in my notes because this is out of order in terms of slides. So the first case I want to talk about is a case from 1879 in which an author named Selden had obtained a registered copyright to Selden's condensed ledger or bookkeeping simplified, which explained a system of bookkeeping and accounting that was novel. But it was particularly dependent on the arrangement of columns and rows. And then another fellow came by, Baker, and issued another book reproducing very closely, because it was the only way that could be done, Selden's columns and rows to discuss a similar system. And this eventually got to the court, and it was found that the arrangement of rows and columns was not copyrightable. It's a questionable whether if he had tried to patent it, it might have been patentable, but it certainly wasn't covered by copyright. The court made an analogy. The copyright of a work on mathematical science cannot give the author exclusive right to the methods of operation which he propounded or which the diagram in his book explains. So there was some exception recognized for ideas in that relatively early case. Then we will fast forward to one of my favorite cases, which is Feist Publications versus Rural Telephone Company. So Feist, the Rural Telephone Service published a number of local directories. Feist went out and tried to get a license from them to reproduce the phone numbers for its own directories and was refused. So it simply copied 4,000 names and phone numbers. The notion being that to get a copyright, and let's go back to Clause A, you could not copyright an idea or a fact. You could only copyright a creative element. And the phone numbers and the way that the telephone directories were arranged, which was in alphabetical order, was not sufficiently novel for it to be protected by copyright. And so that brings us to this slide, which you can, and the reason I put it here is I'm not sure it applied, but it was the very first case I had in school. And it does relate tangentially to this. So back in the 1800s, some enterprising young fellow swept up, actually, I think he had a couple of people helping him, swept up all the horse manure in the town square. And then he went to the town inn and had a few drinks, went home to bed, came back the following morning to discover somebody had made off with all the piles of manure. And the essential holding of the Connecticut Supreme Court that looked at the case was that, as I remember it, the fellow had taken something that was in the wild and converted it to his own ownership by putting time and effort into gathering it all. The person the next day that made off with it was making off with the fruit of his labors. Now, the thing that various opinions of the Supreme Court have been made clear is that copyright applies to creativity. It does not apply to the sweat of one's brow. Even though one has spent a lot of time and effort creating a work, that isn't necessarily copyrightable. And there are bounds on what can be copyrighted. And a case I'm not going to talk about, but it's very clear that if you are a painter or a writer or a poet, your style cannot be copyrighted. And that while if it is close, the work you produce is closely similar to something done by a painter or an author, if it's sufficiently close, if there is substantial similarity, then you violated the copyright. But if you merely paint in the style of another painter, that is not a violation of the first painter's copyright. And so developed the notion of fair use. You can use portions of an author's work so long as they are considered to fall within a fair use exception. People often think of that, particularly professors, is that you can use and reproduce so much. Oh boy, I've got to speed up. You can only use a few lines, 500 words or something of somebody else's work to copy in your own work to illustrate a point. But the actual notion of fair use is much broader and has been, I thought I had this here. We're getting ahead. Has been broadened, so it's basically where it stands now, the fast forward, is that you copy something if your use of the copyrighted material is transformative. In other words, if it changes it to something else, which has its own creative value. So here, a visual artist named Koons, who you may be familiar with, took a bunch of photographs from fashion magazines and created a work of art he called Niagara. And this went up to the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And his use of these legs was found sufficiently transformative from the original legs of the models in the fashion magazines that it was a new work of art, and therefore within the fair use exception as having created something basically novel. A similar thing, a photographer named Carew was with the Rastafarians for 6 years, took a lot of photographs, published a book, and then Richard Prince, supported by the Guggenheim Foundation and a bank in Germany, created a couple of exhibits in which he used these excerpts, some of the pictures from Carew's book in his illustrations. Again, this use of the other photographs in a novel in a different way was also held to be sufficiently creative that it felt transformative, that it fell within the fair use exception. And so despite the fact that there are these lawsuits claiming that the LLMs have violated authors' copyrights, I think it's, oh, I had mentioned one other case. US Supreme Court case in 2020 held that the copying by Google of 1,100 lines of code from the API for Java that Sun Microsystems had originally written and now were owned by Oracle was within the fair use exception. Google wanted to copy a portion of the API because there were a lot of programmers out there that knew and understood that API, and they wished to use this. They wished to encourage the programmers to create applications for their new Android smartphone. And the court held that just flat out copying of a relatively substantial number of lines fell within the fair use exception. I'll skip by Buffalo Bill and we'll go to the second question about AI and the law that I wanted to talk about, which is, can you copyright the output of an LLM or a machine? Well, before AI, there was an effort to copyright a monkey selfie, which the US Copyright Office denied registering the copyright because the picture was not taken by a human being. If we go back and look at Article Section 8, Clause 8, it's clear that copyrights and inventions belong to human beings. And there is a computer scientist by the name of Stephen Thaler that seems to have made a career out of trying to get someone to recognize a patent right or a copyright in the product of some of his artificial intelligence systems. He's tried in England, he's tried in Australia, he's tried in South Africa, and really met no success. Most recently, earlier this year, there was a case in the US District Court for the District of Columbia upholding the rejection of an effort to copyright this picture that was produced by AI. The Registrar of Copyright said, no, not produced by a human being, and this was upheld by the District Court. How far beyond 30 minutes am I? Okay. There'll be time for questions later. I'll turn this over to somebody that can tell you what AI really is.
So,
Did that?
so come on up, Leo, and you can unplug me. This is Leo Zellman, the CEO of Ladris. I'm hoping you'll tell us a little bit about that. Do you need to plug your computer in while I yip-yap along here? I won't tell any more jokes, I promise. All you who just came in missed the best jokes of the day. Yeah, just unplug that. Oh, technology. How many great conferences have been stalled for the lack of good AV? And there it is. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Leo Zellman.
All right, well, thank you very much, Gil, for having us here, and the Nevada County ERC in general for hosting this event. It's my pleasure to be here with you all today. And what we're going to do over the course of my two presentations is look at the history and really the technology of AI, a little bit on the theoretical level, and then the milestones that we've had in getting to where we are today, and really just talk about why we're talking about it right now at all, right? Because that's, I think, to a large part why we're here. And I will do my best to build on Eric's very prescient and well put together analysis with regards to some of the parallels between early advancements and what we see today as well. Unlike Eric's presentation, mine is unfortunately all text. Not much of it, which should make it easy for you, but there is no pictures. So I do apologize for that. Nonetheless, I think it should be pretty interesting. So the first question is, why now? Like, why AI? Why now? Why are we talking about it today? And I think actually Eric's presentation does a great job laying out the case for that, and that is that this is probably one of the most significant steps forward, certainly in recent human history, and maybe ever. If you look, one of the analogies I like to use a lot of the time is that, about 5,000 years ago, we got writing, and, look how quickly we came to be where we are today, right? The universe has been around for a couple billion years. 5,000 years is the blink of an eye, but the ability to share and create and store information really changes the game in terms of your ability to be productive and get more done with the same amount of resources. And most of cosmology and physics is organized on the basis that you are trying to understand how information is transmitted and stored. And so computing obviously is a remarkable step forward in all of those domains. So in terms of, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but in terms of implications for where we are today, it's probably not an exaggeration to say it's a bit of a watershed moment for us, right? It's a massive step forward in our capabilities as a species and our ability to do things that 100 years ago would have been unimaginable. So first off, thinking about what is AI, right? What do we mean when we say artificial intelligence as opposed to natural intelligence? Why are we talking about it now if it's been a thing for 50 years? And so the important thing to remember is that for as long as we've had computing, we've been thinking about how to reproduce what we do in our heads with a machine. So some early examples of that, actually even before the 40s, even before Alan Turing and the Enigma machine and all those kind of advances around World War II, there have been theorists working on constructs for basically advancements in these kind of binary operations, zeros and ones, right? That's what the architecture comes down to, for most all of our, binary digital computers that we have today. And so, in the 1950s, Alan Turing comes up with the Turing test, and that's how do you know if you're talking to a robot, right? And this is around the time of the Rand Corporation and a lot of game theory and geopolitical strategy and that kind of thing. So it fits right in very well with that. But fundamentally, the question he poses is, can you tell if you're talking to a machine? And you might think of ChatGPT today and say, well, I'm not sure. Maybe not always. If I didn't know that I was talking to it, would I know that that's an artificial construct, not a human being on the other end of the line? So today we're looking at kind of, have we crossed that point for some applications? Like, does the Turing test still hold up? I mean, that's what you do, like when you have the little CAPTCHA thing on the screen for your internet, right? It's, are you a robot? Click all the school buses if you're not a robot, that kind of thing. It's the same principle. And the field saw a lot of jumps forward and then a lot of what you call like AI winters, which is a period of relative disinterest or decline or kind of lack of optimism that we could make it a lot better than it was. And that's true of most fields, really not unique to AI. But as with anything, the advancements that we see today are the product of a lot of small iterations over the last 100 years. And so while, OpenAI or, other large corporations get a lot of credit, and rightly so, for making some very significant, high-profile, visible marketing leaps forward, it is ultimately the result of, many, many, many small iterative advancements over the last century. And the other piece I want to touch on is the expectations that we have with it, right? So when we say AI, we're thinking something like us, whatever we are, however we think, it should be able to do that too. So the expectations are higher than they are perhaps in other fields where the bar is not human consciousness. That's a very high bar to clear. We still haven't cleared that, right? No matter how advanced we are today. So that's the other piece of it to bear in mind when we're talking about AI winters. I think that the promise of AI is so extreme that it's very difficult for anything to quite live up to that. And that's why you see, a lot of jumps forward and then a lull, and a jump forward and a lull. We're currently in another jump forward, but there probably will be, like every hype cycle, a little bit of a lull, and a little bit of okay, it's not quite as good as we thought. We need to wait for that next breakthrough. Some people say we're already pushing the limits of the current transformer architecture that we're using for GPT models like ChatGPT. So let's talk a little bit about that. How does this thing work in as simple terms as possible? And this is obviously a very high level overview. We're not going to cover probably most everything that's relevant, but just kind of hitting the high points here. So for, as early as the 1920s, actually, the first neural networks were kind of theoretically pioneered, even before you had really computers to do anything with those. And in the 70s and the 80s, these became more practical and implemented. And of course, computing came a long way in that time. There's basically two categories of advancements that we might look at. The first is theoretical, and the second is compute, the ability to actually execute the theory that you're coming up with here. And so, if you're thinking of a neural net, it's basically you have some input information. That could be text, it could be a picture. You have a series of layers. And in these layers, you have what we call nodes. And nodes are basically just an equation, each one of them. And the goal is to put in some inputs, pass it through these layers, and get something out on the other end. And really, the bigger picture goal is to correlate what you're putting in with what you're getting out, right? So, to basically teach a computer, for example, that apples come in green and red rather than blue and purple. And that, when you see an apple, it's likely to be green or red and not blue or purple. Something that we do very, very easily. And most of our whole life is spent making these associations. So a neural network, partially inspired, especially in the later stages, by these biological concepts, you might consider to be an extremely stripped down version of some of our own processes that we have. Not the same, of course. There's no chemistry going on in neural nets. And the architecture space is fundamentally still zeros and ones, right? And we are not ourselves based on zeros and ones. So that is a pretty substantial difference, and one that we're still not really quite sure how to overcome. But in any case, in the 90s, there was one of those leap forwards, and that was the invention of long-term, short-term memory. So instead of having a sort of a basic equation at every one of those nodes that was trying to make some connections, you had one that could remember more, basically. Could remember a little bit more of what came through the layers before it, and this let you have a little bit more of a feedback loop. And that made it way better at associating things, basically. It was way better at determining if apples were red or green. The only problem is it's very slow. So if we're thinking of input information to a neural net, we're thinking of a sentence. Like many of you probably use ChatGPT. You say, tell me a story, and it tells you a story. And what it's doing is it's taking in the first input is tell me a story. And that's the input. And it breaks that down. And in the old model, it would have broken that down like character by character, like TELL, and then the whole sentence, right? And then try to correlate, try to produce a story based on that input. And you can see that even if there's a theoretical path to doing that, that's extremely expensive because you have to basically make an association between every single point of input and every conceivable possible point of output. It's a huge multi-dimensional sample space that even with really powerful computers, it just takes a long time. And so the kind of remarkable advances that we see today are due in large part to the invention of transformers. And the transformer model was originally invented at Google in 2017. And basically the remarkable step forward that it enabled was you could do it all at once. You could do it in parallel. And that's made possible not just by the theory, but by advances in compute, right? So, the CPU, which is like the basic chip of a computer, the core processing unit for a computer, was great for sequential operations and really what you might call like business logic, input, output, I/O, that kind of thing. But there was another kind, and let's see if I have this on the slide here. Yeah, compute advancements. There's another kind of chip, and now we have a whole lot of specialized chips for other things, tensor processing units and that kind of thing, that was made to process in parallel. And originally for images and videos and that kind of thing. So, an image, you break it down into pixels. A lot of those pixels are the same. It's the same way that compression algorithms work, right? If you have a PDF and you want to compress it, what you're doing basically is saying, okay, every pixel on that is white, I can represent in the same piece of information. I don't need to duplicate that, 40,000 times or however many identical pixels there are. Right, so it's the same principle here with, it's a similar principle, I should say, with GPUs or graphical processor units, right? It's designed for graphics and mass media encoding. And NVIDIA was one of the first to make this at a large scale. They're obviously benefiting immensely from that today, but it just so happens that GPUs are really great for AI because what you need, going back to this slide, is a lot of the architecture that we've had for a long time, but you need to be able to do it all at once. Otherwise, it's intractable. It's a problem that can be solved but won't be solved. And so GPUs basically make it possible to, clear that hurdle. And that's what makes it possible, really, for you to put in, tell me a story, and for it to give you a story. Because what it's doing is, rather than breaking it down in sequence, it's now doing massive operations in parallel. Now that's very expensive, right? So this is why, and actually I want to draw a parallel to Eric's insightful point, which I didn't know about stationers. Today, the foundation models for these AIs are mostly controlled by these giant mega corporations, right? Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, Amazon, basically, and Facebook, Meta now. And that's because you have to have an insane amount, even with parallelism, you have to have a ton of compute resources to actually train one of these models. So, we can expect that, I think in the future, we're going to continue to see, efficiencies, cost efficiencies come out of this, and it's going to become cheaper, relatively speaking, to train these models. But we're still going through that right now, much as in times past, you had to set up a whole print shop, and it was expensive and a very difficult effort. And there were only 40 of them or 20 of them, as Eric said. And that was the only ones that could do this. Today, that's kind of where we're at with the big foundation models. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't, spin one of those things up without dropping in, a couple $100 million basically to set up a data center to do that. And that's, that's why you see a lot of venture investment right now in generative AI, because that's what it'll take basically at this point. If you want to get ahead of the field, you need to spend a lot of money on compute. And we of course benefit from the fact that computers get more efficient every year, but Moore's law, may not go on forever. Some people will say it's already failing. That's the notion that transistors double every 2 years. You basically get, an exponentially better chip over time than you started out with. But that still takes time for us to do, basically. So because of these advancements in the technology and in the compute, and Gil, I'd also ask if you don't mind giving me a heads up on the time as well. That'd be super appreciated. Excellent. Thank you very much. We can now turn to two of the kind of macro scale advancements that sort of economically allowed us to be where we are today. Because it's not just the technology and the theory. You also have to have the right conditions for something like this to happen. And there's basically two like macro conditions that allowed our current moment to emerge. And the first is with any, and this is true of our work at Ladris and really any company that's doing AI, if you want to put out a quality model, and a model is just that, ChatGPT, that's a model, right? That pre-trained AI that can answer questions, can do things for you. You basically need two things. The first is a lot of data to train it on. And the second is, a high quality of model fidelity to actually make that something that's professional grade and usable. And of course, part of that is you have to have the compute resources to keep that up and keep that running and keep it training. And so for a long time, we didn't have enough data. Even if we had all the theory, even if we had all the compute resources, we probably wouldn't have had enough data to really train one of these things to the point that it's useful for such a wide range of applications. One example you might use is that I think the number of people, the number of daily active users or monthly active users on Facebook today is, almost twice as much as there were people in the world in like 1910 or something like that, right? Like 1 billion, 2 billion people, and now we've got 4 billion people on Facebook. So every single one of us is a producer of data, right? So there's obviously very interesting like political theory going back to the Rand Corporation, ironically, like very interesting geopolitical and political theory considerations for all of this, right? Who's producing the data? Who's using the data, right? Those kind of questions. And it's pretty clear we are producing the data. And again, that's because we're not limited by a kind of binary architecture. Our brains don't work like that. And so while AI is capable at the moment of making incredible rehashed, vectorized connections of information that we created, it's probably unlikely that it'll create anything fundamentally new for a very long time until we get out of the transformer architecture. Now we expect to get out of that architecture. There'll be another step forward, right? But with the architecture that we have today, and you see this even in model deployments, we're ultimately limited to the quality of the information that we put in the thing. And this makes sense, right? I mean, the kind of like entropy, law of thermodynamics, right? Second law, you lose a little bit every time. You can't, energy, you can't always have like perfect retainment of energy. So every time you create, new information, you train the model, there's a little bit of that you're not going to get back. And basically what that means is you need people to continue producing that information. Otherwise, the quality of the model gets worse because it can't be trained on its own stuff. Basically, there's information that's been lost that it can't get back during the process of training. And And you get sort of that kind of degradation cycle that results in eventually a very poor quality product, and that won't sell. And therefore, we won't make any money and we won't be able to advance the field anymore. Right? So you have to have a high quality supply of good data. And it just so happens that the internet was the catalyst that allowed tons and tons of people to put all of that in a place where everyone could see it. And ultimately, in the end, the kind of first mass marketed GPT model was trained basically on the internet. As much information as you could get from everywhere that you could get it, which is pretty remarkable when you look at it. And there's actually a really good article. I'm not sure if it's coming up here in the presentation, but and I can't take credit for this. This is Andreessen Horowitz, the famed VC firm. I think it's an article by Mark Andreessen that says basically if you're looking at like these advancements and why this is such a remarkable step forward, you have the computer, which brings the marginal cost of information storage down to near zero over time, right? So you can on a thumb drive store like everything everyone knew in the whole world in like the year 1000 AD or whatever it is, right? All that can be kept on a thumb drive at the moment. Which is pretty crazy. And then the internet allows you to transmit that information at near zero cost. So anyone can talk to anybody instantly, and all that information on that thumb drive can be shared with everyone instantly. And what's really remarkable about generative AI, as opposed to AI that came before, is that it brings the marginal cost of creation of that information down to near zero. So we were able to store it, we were able to transmit it, but now we don't have to, we can create it at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time, and everyone can do that. And so naturally, if you think about this in terms of like implications for the future, if writing was the great catalyst for civilization, which it absolutely was, that and agriculture, but you don't have agriculture without writing, then something that can write for you should be a similarly huge step forward. And we happen to be, because of that, on a little bit of that exponential curve at the moment. So what we're going to do is kind of, I think, stop there. I know we got another 5 minutes, Gil, but in talking about the future and kind of future economics of this, there's a couple things that I'd like to say as we look ahead. But I'd like to save that for the second half, and we'll do a little Q&A there as well. Any of the stuff that we talked about here, and of course, just other questions that you may have. So I'll yield the rest of my time, and we'll take it from there during the second half. Thank you.
So we talked a little bit about so let me step back. Another reason that there is the reading of copyrighted material on the internet falls within fair use is that, at least in concept, it's not like ChatGPT has a copy of Buffalo Bill's poem stored on disk somewhere. It's not taking all that information and put it someplace that it's easily accessible and it can access it. But rather, what it has done is it has taken that poem, Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a water smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, what a I've forgotten it. It's very short. It doesn't exist. There's no way that you can ask GPT to reproduce that and be confident that you're going to get exactly that poem. It's not like you can go and search on keywords and somewhere there's a file on the internet that's exactly that poem. And so that process of breaking it up and reconfiguring it is why there's that transformative use. So, but as you know, the AI has gotten a lot of attention. And as usual, pardon me, but some of my prejudices are going to show here. This has become an opportunity to scare people. Because we hear AI, we hear it's coming, we hear it's going to be pervasive, and we think war games. And more recently, we think Skynet. Well, let's let's make a distinction uh, between uh, between generative AI, which is AI that generates stuff, and so that's referred to as GAI often, and then artificial general intelligence. And I think Leo will tell you that we're a long way from artificial general intelligence. What we have is some very capable software at doing very specific things, uh, generating images, recognizing images, generating text. And it appears to understand text. One of the problems with AI is it is so much like a person when you talk to it that you think there's really more there than actually exists. But that does not mean it's not very capable. What it does mean is that there's no intention behind it. It doesn't have a personality unless you force it to adopt a particular style. There's nothing there that seeks to dominate or control anything, much less Homo sapiens. Generative AI, artificial general intelligence, who knows? Uh, I have a syllabus over here of some things I've read on AI that I found pretty interesting. One of them is another article by Mark Andreessen on how generative AI is the hope for the future, how it makes us much smarter at what we do. And that's always been a leverage uh, in terms of human success. The more intelligent we can become, the more successful we become, and the more fruits of our labors there are to enjoy. Uh, Along the way, there's a discussion of the paperclip problem. Maybe generative AI is not intentionally ambitious. Maybe it doesn't seek to dominate, but what if you tell it to produce the maximum number of paper clips? If it's smarter than we are, isn't it going to maximize all of society in the production of paper clips? If that's what you've told it to maximize? Well, Mark thinks that, you know, I won't say what he thinks of that argument, but suffice it to say, if we're smart enough to create a program that can turn the world into producing paper clips, we're probably also smart enough to produce a program that can guard against that. But let's go back to printing, because printing is really interesting. How many of you recognize this man? I'll give you another shot at it. Martin Luther. In 1517, he is said to nail his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. He was a heretic. He dissented from the Catholic Church. And within 3 years, Pope Leo II had banned all of his books. That stack of books you see right there under his hand, gone. And that's what happened as printing took hold. The stationer's company was, you had to register your book with them, and they were in charge of, they had authority to print the book or not, but it was only if they met certain standards that were eventually codified by the Star Chamber, which those of you that have had Western civilization in your youth may remember as being one of the most despotic courts that have ever ruled and responsible for many of the elements in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and elsewhere that are designed to protect citizens from the state. So what did the, I don't have it on the slide. I'll have to read it to you. So the duty of the printers was to testify before printing a book that the book contained nothing that was contrary to the Christian faith, nor against the state or government, nor contrary to the good life or good manners or otherwise. And the prohibitions, wrong way, no. The prohibitions for violating that were severe. For example, where's the date? In roughly in 1557, two printers opposed the proposed marriage of Elizabeth to the Duke of Anjou, and printed pamphlets arguing against it. And for that, they had their right hands chopped off by a butcher's cleaver. The state wants to control things, and controlling of printing was the way it found to do that. So where are we today? Well, every government entity, every government is thinking of ways to control generative AI. And in the US, I mean, I don't want to say that's universal. There's some proposals to try to increase funding for AI and do some other things. Make sure the technology doesn't get exported to China, that type of thing. But when you hear the FTC talk about AI, or you hear the White House talk about AI, one of the things they're most concerned about is that it not be discriminatory, and that it not disadvantage people. Well, the European Union is far ahead of the regulation of AI than the US is. There has been a proposal by the European Commission dating back to a couple of years. That was taken up by the European Parliament, and they have a draft regulation, 161 pages of it, that's been proposed. There's going to be negotiations between the Parliament, the Commission, and the European Council, with the expectation that there will be regulation next year. What they have done is define 4 levels of AI. And the first level of AI is to be prohibited completely. And they describe that AI, I'm going to need my glasses for this because it's not on my screen, is systems that use an AI system that deploys subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior. And frankly, I listen to that, and as a lawyer, I have to say, if there was ever a subjective standard, this must be it. Because just about everything I read is intended to change my behavior. If I read a novel, a lot of the messages in that novel are subliminal. And who is to say what is material to my consciousness or not? Well, in Europe, it's apparently the European Council. Or that's intended to materially distort the behavior of a person that's a member of a group in a manner. I'll turn the page here. That causes such person physical or psychological harm. Apparently, I grew up, sticks and stones can hurt my bones, but words will never break me. That is apparently no longer true. apparently words can cause severe psychological harm. And that harm is, the determination of that harm is in the ear of the listener. Um, this to me is not much different than uh, a prohibition that against writing anything that's contrary to the Christian faith or contrary to the good life or good manners. There's another level that they regulate, low risk. Mostly that's disclosure. And I'm certainly in favor of that. I think if you publish a deep fake photograph that's been created by AI, good thing that if you make it clear to the viewer that that's not what really happened, it's something that was artificially created. I've got no problem with that. There's a category of high risk AI, which involves biometric information, managing critical infrastructure, educational admissions. Can't use AI to pick out who the best candidates for your school are. Access to employment. We don't want AI reading resumes and deciding who should be employed. Used by law enforcement with a number of exceptions. Border control, product safety. AI should not be in charge of product safety. That one I really don't understand. Social protection management. Again, not sure what that is. Well, so as more and more people heard and learned about AI at the beginning of this year, there was more attention paid to the draft act on AI in the European Union. And of course, a lot of companies that are promoting AI said, hey, maybe we better get involved. And they went and they lobbied the EU. And now there is a fourth category called foundational models, which are pretty much what you might think they are. And these are still heavily regulated. To the extent that the cost of meeting the European regulations is going to be probably still not the huge cost of reading the internet, the huge computing cost, but it's going to be quite significant. What that's going to mean is that there are only going to be a few entities out there that have the capability of really owning and having created their own fundamental foundational AI. And my prejudice is, I think, a very American one as opposed to European one, which is to diversify the sources of power as much as possible. I think as individuals, we are better protected, we have more freedom if there are a multitude of sources of power such that, and you've all learned this political theory when you had a course in American government. Congress is a limitation on the president is a limitation on Congress, and the court is a limitation on both, but both can limit the president appoints judges and they're confirmed by the Senate. The same is true of commercial power. A diversity of sources makes us all better off. You have to register, much like you had to register books, you're going to have to register that foundational AI with extensive disclosure about it. And in addition, you have to guarantee that, let me see if I can find the language again. Basically, it doesn't produce content that's violated of European law. And the thing I find most interesting about that is not that, is who's being regulated. Now, there's some people that are in favor of this. I'm not. They're the people that seek to regulate the gun manufacturers rather than the fellow pulling the trigger. So rather than the fellow taking something, he's out there at his computer, he sits down, and hate speech is heavily regulated in the European Union. And he has an interaction with an AI that leads to something that can be considered hate speech. Who gets in trouble? And then that individual takes it and publishes it on the internet. Who gets in trouble? Not the fellow that published it on the internet, but the entity that made, the company that made a very general purpose entity for which they could not regulate the use because it is so general purpose. And that's the point. It can be used for many, many different tasks. Finally, just a comment on EU regulation, because there was another study done recently by the, and I think I do have the slide. There we go. So you all, I'm sure, have heard of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union, a 250-page regulation designed to protect largely personal data. The number of new apps has declined by 40% from the 6-month period preceding the adoption of the GDPR. And this is both in terms of new apps being generated in Europe or new apps being imported, with huge fines on American companies that break the rules. And it looks like my time is up. I have 5 more minutes. I'll let Leo use them, and then we'll take more time answering questions. Oh, one last thing. What do I think the real danger of AI is over time? This is a personal favorite because I wrote a novel, a sci-fi novel, before the recent AI came out. It's amazing the number of people that now have LLMs as girlfriends. I am told, and I have not investigated this, but that the porn manufacturers are pretty good at creating sex dolls. And what I do know of is that Amazon now has robots that can do backflips. You put that all together, and in 20 years, you may have a reasonably good facsimile of a companion that will have an engaging conversation over dinner, take you to bed, and then while you're sleeping, do all of the housework. I think that's going to be pretty hard to turn down. And with that, Leo, you're on.